The Wagner mercenary group has been banned from fighting in Russia's war in Ukraine after a abandoned mutiny against President Vladimir Putin. It spurred a crackdown from the Kremlin, with a top Russian general reportedly detained and questioned by investigators following the weekend rebellion. Joining me now is John Blaxland, Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies at ANU's Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. Professor, thanks so much for your time. This is such an interesting story because we had that almost coup that happened with Wagner in Russia. Then there were reports that Russia was making Wagner troops sign contracts to fight in Russian forces. There was also rumours that Wagner troops were going to Belarus. Now we're getting this reports coming through that Putin is banning from the mercenaries from fighting in the Russian war, which I find hard to believe that Putin would give up 25,000 soldiers considering how badly things are going. What's your take? What do we believe here?
Yeah, Kenny, good to be with you. Thank you. It is really difficult. It's very opaque at the moment. It's hard to know exactly what's going on. We do know that there's a power play going on, that Putin has for a long time wanted to play off the military against, and being an old KGB man, now the FSB, he's been more wary of the military, broadly speaking. So he brought in people who he thought were loyal to him to work in that space. Defence Minister Shoigu, who wears a uniform but doesn't have actually military experience. General Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff, a guy who was known as, given credit for having come up with the Little Green Men and the grey zone operations of 2013, 2014, but has demonstrably failed in Ukraine recently. Prigozhin and the Wagner group was supposed to be a bit of a breakthrough in terms of showing up the military further, but also giving Putin something to crow about, something to be happy about in terms of the breakthrough. But as we saw in the Battle of Bakhmut, thousands of Wagner soldiers were expended in a campaign for little gain, if anything, of any consequence. So the power dynamics, very interesting. Prigozhin's deep resentment at the military for the kind of the jealous kind of infighting between the military and the militia, the mercenary groups like Wagner, generated just a toxic cocktail that saw him going up to Moscow, doing a deal because he was supposed to be Vladimir Putin's best mate, his chef.
Yeah.
And in a place like Moscow, you got to really trust your chef, knowing what gets put in people's meals.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite a heady brew.
Wagner troops, weren't they mostly criminals? I mean, if they're not allowed to fight in Russia and they're not allowed to sign contracts, what happens to them? They go back to prison, or they just let them loose? What is he going to do? Just let them go? So, yeah, it's a mixture of special forces, Spetsnaz, former Spetsnaz soldiers, some of the FSB operatives as well, and prisoners who are now, the ones who've survived the experience of Bakhmut and elsewhere are now reasonably seasoned. You've also got mercenaries from Africa who've got considerable experience there. So it's an eclectic mix of different types whose loyalties are not necessarily to the Russian state or to Putin, but to the warlord themselves, in the case of the Wagner group, to Prigozhin. So whether or not these people can be trusted, I think this is the thing that Putin's realising, is careful what you wish for when you recruit these kind of people into your forces. So does this, in terms of the Russian-Ukraine war, does this weaken Russia further in Ukraine? Because we have been getting reports that Ukraine has been advancing in their offensive, particularly through the east and southeast of the country.
So we do know that the Russian techniques and tactics have refined a little bit. They now have multiple layers of defence. It is now very difficult for the Ukrainian forces to break through this multiple barrier lines that have been set up, with the raw troops at the front line, with rear echelons guarded by people prepared to shoot anyone's retreating. This is a hard nut to crack. But the Ukrainians are doing their level best to explore ways and means to find cracks and go where the expanding torrent might go, where, as Basil Little-Hart might have described it, when talking about the idea of manoeuvre warfare, you go for where the seams open up and then you explore that that seam ripping open, and that seems to be what the Ukrainians are trying to do now. But of course, they're limited, because when we think about it, this is only about 50,000 troops up against a couple of 100,000 of Russian forces in defence. The defence usually has the advantage. When you expose yourself in an offensive manoeuvre, you do risk being caught in the open. And of course, the Russians have an advantage in not only in the defence, but the Ukrainians don't have the right kind of air power. They've asked for the F-16s. There's talk of it coming soon, but not soon enough. They have some Western tanks, but not enough. They have some Western mine breaching equipment and some barrier breaching equipment, but not enough. So they have to be very circumspect about how they use their resources. There was, I think, an expectation after the breakthrough of September last year that the Ukrainians would have another massive breakthrough pretty quickly. Now, we may yet see that in the coming days and weeks, but we have to be realistic about the expectations of what a constrained Ukrainian force can do against even not terribly well-trained or motivated force, but well-resourced in terms of the defensive barriers that they still have there.
Yeah,
he's hoping that they can break through.